There is a version of this country that gets photographed millions of times a year. The harbour bridge lit up at night, the geothermal pools of Rotorua steaming softly in the morning light, the fjords of Milford Sound with their walls of dark rock dropping straight into water so still it looks like a painting. Tourists line up for all of it. Tour operators package it. The government promotes it. Travel writers return from it and describe New Zealand in language that tends toward the superlative. Youngest country, cleanest air, most dramatic landscapes. That version is real enough. I'm not disputing any of it. But there is another version, one that does not appear in the brochures, does not come up in the guided tours, and in several cases has been quietly fenced off, locked away, or reclassified by someone in an office who decided the public did not need to know. This version involves structures that should not exist where they exist, ruins that do not match any official account of who built them or why, and places where the question itself seems to make certain people uncomfortable in ways that are difficult to interpret charitably. I've been in this country a long time, long enough to have walked past some of these places when they were still accessible, and to have watched over the years as the gates went up and the signs went in. Long enough to have spoken with farmers and local historians, and a few researchers who spent years trying to get formal permission to examine sites that anyone with eyes could see was significant. Long enough to know that when something gets locked behind a fence with no clear explanation given, that tends to be when it gets interesting. What I've learned over those years is this: New Zealand's official history is a partial history. That is not a dramatic claim. It is a simple observation about the nature of official histories in general, and about the particular circumstances of a country that was settled relatively recently, that has ongoing and unresolved questions about the depth and diversity of its pre-European past, and that has a bureaucratic and academic establishment that sometimes moves more slowly than the questions require. Today, I want to take you to 15 of those places. 15 ruins and structural sites across New Zealand, North Island and South Island both, that no one has fully explained, and that no one will officially let you see. Go on, subscribe, and I'll tell you the whole story. Number 15, the stone walls of the Coromandel interior. Drive the Coromandel Peninsula far enough from the tourist track, past the beach towns, past the fern-lined roads that everyone photographs, past the last of the roadside cafes selling flat whites and whitebait fritters, and the landscape changes. It becomes harder. The bush closes in. The roads narrow to single lanes that require careful negotiation when you meet someone coming the other way. And if you know what to look for, you start to find walls. Not modern dry stone walls of the kind that farmers build to clear paddocks of surface stone. Older walls, walls with a different quality to them. The stone more deliberately chosen, the courses more carefully laid, the configurations following ridgelines and terraces in patterns that do not correspond to any agricultural logic. These are not walls built to keep animals in or out. They run across terrain where no paddock was ever possible. The official position is straightforward enough. Heritage New Zealand lists several sets of walls on the Coromandel Peninsula as colonial-era boundary infrastructure, built by Pākehā settlers during the gold rush period of the 1860s and 1870s. Case documented and case closed, at least in the official record. The problem is that a portion of the walls in the deeper interior, not all of them, but a significant number, sit in locations that make no agricultural sense whatsoever. Walls running along the tops of steep ridges where the ground on either side drops away sharply, and no meaningful paddock could ever have been established. Walls that appear to be marking something rather than containing something, running for hundreds of meters along elevated features with no obvious beginning or end point. Local historians and amateur researchers in the Coromandel have been raising questions about some of these structures since at least the 1970s. Several of them have published their observations in small regional journals and community histories. The academic archaeological establishment has not, as far as I can determine, followed up on those observations in any systematic way. Part of the difficulty is access. The land the walls sit on is a combination of private farming property and Department of Conservation reserve, and the most remote and anomalous sections are not easy to reach on foot. Coordinated research access would require the cooperation of multiple landowners and a DOC permit process that has not, to my knowledge, been initiated. The walls are still there. Most people who have lived in the Coromandel their entire lives have never seen them. Number 14. The Opōtiki stone alignment. The Bay of Plenty coast east of Tauranga is known for its long north-facing beaches, its high sunshine hours, and the relaxed rhythm of its smaller towns. Opōtiki sits at the mouth of the Wairarapa River at the eastern end of the bay, a quiet town that most travellers pass through on their way to Gisborne or the East Cape. If they stop at all, it is for petrol and a pie. In the low hills a few kilometres inland from Opōtiki, in country that is rougher and less visited than the coastal strip, there's a series of stone formations that does not appear on any tourist map and carries no public signage. The formations include what appears to be a deliberate alignment of standing stones, positioned and oriented in a manner that multiple independent observers have described as too precise to be accidental. The alignment is oriented to mark specific astronomical positions as seen from that hillside. The rising sun at the summer solstice is the most commonly cited, though researchers who have examined survey data from the site have noted secondary alignments as well. Stone alignments of this kind are not unknown in New Zealand. They exist in other parts of the country and have been documented in connection with the navigational and agricultural astronomical knowledge embedded in Maori tradition. The local Wakatohea iwi are the tangata whenua of this area. They hold the site with appropriate cultural weight. It is wahi tapu, sacred ground, and access by outsiders is neither encouraged nor available. That is their right, their decision, and it is not for anyone outside the community to question it. The depth of Maori astronomical and spiritual knowledge embedded in landscapes like this one represents thousands of years of careful observation and accumulated understanding. It belongs to those who carry it. What is worth noting, simply as a matter of record, is that the structure is not discussed anywhere in the general material that New Zealand presents to the world about its history. The astronomical sophistication embedded in these landscapes is real and significant, and its near total absence from the public historical narrative is a gap worth noting. Number 13. The Wairarapa underground chambers. Inland from the Wairarapa coast, in the rough sheep farming country that stretches east of the Tararua Range toward the Pacific Cliffs, there are properties where farmers have periodically uncovered, during fencing and earthworks, the remnants of underground chambers. Stone-lined spaces, roughly rectangular, built below ground level and covered with large flat stones that have subsided over time and become, in some cases, a hazard for livestock. The farming families who have found these features have generally not publicised them. In this part of New Zealand, finding something unusual in the ground tends to result in a specific sequence of events: a phone call to Heritage New Zealand, a visit from someone official, a request that the site not be disturbed, and then a long period of not very much happening. Several farming families in the Wairarapa have described this experience in almost identical terms to local journalists and community historians over the past 2 decades. The wait, in one documented case, extended to 11 years before any follow-up contact was made. What the chambers are has not been officially determined in any published assessment. One explanation that researchers have put forward is that they represent a form of rua, the Maori pit storage architecture used to preserve kumara and other foods through the winter, of a type and scale not previously documented in this part of the North Island. Rua are well known from other regions, and their presence in the Wairarapa would not be surprising given the evidence of significant Maori settlement in the area. A second possibility, which has been raised more cautiously by researchers who have examined photographs and informal measurements of the chambers, is that some of them predate the Maori settlement period as it is currently understood. The construction technique in several of the chambers, the dressing of the stone, the method of corbelling the roof, has been described as inconsistent with the Rua tradition and potentially indicative of an earlier construction method. That second possibility is the one that tends to produce the most official silence. The sites remain on private land, Access is controlled by individual farming families with varying levels of interest in research, and the coordinated archaeological investigation that would be needed to resolve the question has not been undertaken. Number 12. The Muriwai cliff structures. Muriwai is on the west coast of Auckland, roughly 50 kilometres from the city centre, and it is one of those places that feels like a different world from the urban sprawl to the east. The beach is long and exposed, the sand is black, the surf is powerful and consistent, and in season the gannet colony on Owaia Island just offshore fills the air with noise and movement. Most people who come to Muriwai come for the gannets, or the surf, or simply the scale of the place, what they do not generally see, because you have to know where to look, and because the section of cliff where the relevant formations are visible is fenced off and has been for more than a decade, are the stone features that have been exposed in the cliff face by coastal erosion. These are not natural rock formations. The coastal cliff at Muriwai is a soft, layered material, compressed volcanic ash and sediment, and where it erodes, you see its internal structure clearly. What has been revealed in one particular section is dressed stone that has been cut and shaped and placed within the cliff body, not formed there by natural process. The Department of Conservation closed the relevant section of cliff to public access in the early 2010s, citing coastal erosion hazard. That designation is legitimate. The cliffs at Muriwai do erode, and they have claimed lives. But the closure also coincided with a period of increased attention from independent researchers who were beginning to document the stone features, and more than one of those researchers has noted the timing. No formal Heritage New Zealand assessment of the stone features has been published as far as I have been able to determine. The erosion that exposed them continues. At some point, the relevant section of cliff will collapse into the sea, and whatever is in it will be gone. The tours to the gannet colony run daily, year-round. Number 11, the Maungakiekie terracing anomaly. Maungakiekie, One Tree Hill, is one of Auckland's volcanic cones, and it is also one of the most thoroughly documented Maori archaeological sites in the country. The PAA that occupied the mountain before European settlement was among the largest in New Zealand, with a resident population estimated at several thousand people at its peak. The earthwork terracing that covered its slopes was the infrastructure of that population. Platforms for houses, gardens, storage, defence. Heritage New Zealand manages the mountain as a public park and a scheduled archaeological site. It is, in other words, one of the most studied sites in New Zealand, which makes it all the more interesting that there is a section of it that has not been adequately explained. On the northern and northwestern slopes of the mountain, there's a section of terracing whose configuration does not match the expected patterns of a defensive PA. The arrangement of certain platforms in this area and the spacing of what appear to be post-hole depressions associated with them suggests a different purpose, not defensive, not residential in the standard sense, but possibly observational or ceremonial. Several academic archaeologists have published papers noting this anomaly. The papers sit in journals where they are read by other academics and not by the hundreds of thousands of people who walk up that mountain every year. The public interpretation of Maungakiekie does not address this section in any detail. When researchers have sought extended independent access to conduct more thorough investigation, the approval process has been, in the experience of more than one researcher, lengthy to a degree that seems disproportionate for a site that is already open to the public 6 days a week. The mountain is right there in the middle of Auckland. The anomaly is sitting on the slope. The explanations are not coming. Number 10. The Doubtful Sound stone platform. Fjordland is the most remote corner of New Zealand's South Island, a landscape of such consistent grandeur that it has a tendency to make visitors feel slightly underdressed for the occasion. Doubtful Sound, Patea in Maori, a name that references its significance as a place of spiritual weight rather than doubt in the English sense, is accessible only by a combination of Lake Manapuri boat crossing and overland coach transfer. The number of visitors it receives each year is a fraction of those who go to Milford Sound. It is quieter, heavier somehow. In a sheltered inlet off the main body of Doubtful Sound, visible from the water at low tide and in calm conditions, there is a stone platform. not a natural rock shelf. The geology does not produce natural formations of this regularity. A constructed platform. Large flat stones laid in a consistent pattern, extending approximately 15 metres along the shoreline at a consistent height above the waterline, with internal coursing that indicates deliberate construction rather than natural deposition. Fjordland was not an area of permanent Maori settlement. The climate is harsh, among the highest rainfall anywhere in New Zealand, and the terrain does not support the agriculture that permanent habitation requires. But the sounds were used seasonally for fishing and for the collection of punamu, greenstone, whose sources lie further south, and stone platforms associated with seasonal fishing camps and canoe landings are known from other parts of the New Zealand coast. What distinguishes this platform from a simple landing stage is its scale and the weight of the stone used in its construction. Researchers who have examined it have suggested that the effort involved in building it exceeds what a seasonal fishing camp would require, and that its position, sheltered at the mouth of a minor inlet, oriented to the north, may indicate a more significant function. Access by private boat requires a DOSI permit. Applications from researchers seeking to conduct detailed measurements of the platform have been in process for extended periods. The permit system exists for good reasons. The platform also exists, and the question of what it was built for has not been answered. Number 9. The Otago Stone Rose. Central Otago is unlike anywhere else in New Zealand. The landscape is semi-arid and ancient feeling. Ochre tussock, silver schist, the smell of thyme in the heat, long views to mountains that turn purple in the late afternoon. It was gold country in the 1860s, and the rush that followed the discovery of the metal brought tens of thousands of men into terrain that had previously known only small Maori populations moving seasonally between the coast and the interior. The evidence of the gold rush is everywhere. Stone chimney stacks standing in paddocks where the houses around them rotted away generations ago. The scars of hydraulic sluicing still visible in the earth. The occasional rusted remnant of machinery. But mixed in with the colonial-era stonework, in parts of central Otago, particularly on the elevated terraces above the Clutha River Basin and on the slopes above the Maungakiekie Valley, there are stone formations that have nothing to do with gold mining. Low rows of stones running in parallel lines across the terrain, spaced at consistent intervals of roughly 4 to 6 metres, extending in some cases for several hundred metres before disappearing into erosion or the edge of modern farmland. They are not mining infrastructure. They are not boundary markers of the colonial type, which follow property lines and fence lines. They are too low for walls and too regular for random stone clearing. A geomorphologist who was consulted about them in the 1990s confirmed that they are not natural features, not the result of frost patterning or periglacial sorting, which can produce regular stone arrangements in this kind of terrain. An archaeologist and a surveyor who published separate assessments of 2 different sets of the rows in the 1990s. Both concluded that they were built to a consistent plan, with deliberate orientation, and that the construction method was more consistent with pre-European practice than with colonial-era stonework. Both also noted that the official archaeological record for the region did not include any formal assessment of the formations. That official record remains incomplete. The rows sit on private farmland and crown land in roughly equal measure. Coordinated research access has not been arranged. If you know where to look, you can see them from certain roads in the Maungakiekie and Clutha districts. Most people drive past them at speed, their eyes on the mountains. There is something quietly dispiriting about that. Not because the stone rows are necessarily of world-shaking significance. They may turn out to have a mundane explanation that simply hasn't been articulated yet, but because the gap between what is physically there and what the official record acknowledges is so large, and has been large for so long, that it begins to feel like a structural feature rather than an oversight. Central Otago has been extensively studied for its gold rush heritage. The museums are good, the walking tracks are maintained, and yet the stone rows sit in the paddocks unassessed, year after year, visible from the road. If you have seen these formations and have a different account of what they might be, I would genuinely like to hear it. Leave it in the comments. Number 8. The Whanganui River Structure. the Whanganui River, Te Awa Tupua in Maori, which translates roughly as the river that is a living ancestor and which is now legally recognised as a person under New Zealand law, one of only a handful of natural features in the world to hold this status, runs from the volcanic plateau of the central North Island down through a gorge of extraordinary depth and beauty to the Tasman Sea at Whanganui City. It has been a highway and a home for Maori communities for centuries, and the culture of its river people is among the richest and most distinctive in New Zealand. About 70 kilometres upriver from the coast, in a section accessible only by jet boat or by multi-day canoe journey through the Whanganui National Park, there is a stone structure on the true right bank, a low wall of dressed stone running parallel to the river for approximately 20 metres, before turning at a right angle and continuing into the bush at an angle that suggests it once had more extent than is currently visible. The stone is not local river stone. It does not match the geological signature of the riverbanks in that section. It has been transported from somewhere else. The Whanganui iwi have knowledge of the structure. What they have shared broadly with researchers who have worked with the community is that the site is associated with a significant historical event and that it carries spiritual weight. The specific cultural knowledge about the structure is held within the community and is not for general circulation. What the physical characteristics of the structure invite, independent of cultural interpretation, is a practical question about the engineering, the dressed stone, the transportation over terrain that does not offer easy passage, the construction technique that involves fitting large stones together in a manner that does not match the typical construction patterns of the recorded archaeological period. These are observations about the structure itself, not claims about its meaning. The river is navigable. The structure is not publicized. The photographs that exist of it are not widely available. And the full account of its construction and purpose remains to be given. Subscribe to show that these videos actually help and that they make sense. It is a small thing and it costs you nothing, but it makes this kind of work possible. Number 7. The Kaikōura Peninsula Chambers. The Kaikōura Peninsula is one of those places in New Zealand where the geography produces something almost theatrical. The mountains come right to the sea here. There's almost no flat ground between the peaks and the water, and on a clear day the combination of snow and ocean and the light off the Kaikōura Range is difficult to look away from. The town is built on a raised marine terrace, old seabed pushed up by the kind of geological uplift that still produces occasional earthquakes. And the whale-watching industry that operates from here is one of the most established in the country. The sperm whales come because the submarine canyon just offshore drops to extraordinary depths very close to the coast, and the deep water brings the food they need. Below the walking tracks on the peninsula and in the inland face of the terrace itself, there are natural cave formations in the limestone and calcareous rock. Some of these caves are known and documented. They appear in the Heritage New Zealand record and have been studied to some degree. But in the inland side of the peninsula, accessed from private farming land that borders the DOC reserve, there are chambers that do not match the pattern of natural cave formation. They are too regular. The entrances have been worked, not dramatically altered, but modified in ways that are visible to anyone looking carefully. The edges of the openings shaped, the floor levels adjusted, the internal dimensions expanded beyond what the natural geology would have produced. A geologist and an archaeologist who independently examined photographs of the relevant chambers reached the same conclusion. The natural cave openings had been modified by human activity at some point in the past. Heritage New Zealand was notified of these chambers in 2009. The response, according to the farmer on whose land the chambers sit and who has discussed the matter with local journalists, was an acknowledgement of the notification and a request not to disturb the site. A formal assessment was indicated as the next step. As of the time I am recording this, no published assessment has appeared in any publicly accessible Heritage New Zealand record. 15 years is a long time to wait for an assessment of something that a geologist and an archaeologist have both said warrants investigation. The whale-watching industry at Kaikōura is worth tens of millions of dollars a year to the local economy. The town rebuilt itself remarkably after the 2016 earthquake. People come from all over the world to stand on the deck of a boat and watch sperm whales surface in the cold blue water. The chambers in the hillside behind the town are waiting for someone to look at them properly. They have been waiting for 15 years. They will presumably keep waiting. Number 6, the Raglan Standing Stone. Raglan is a surf town on the west coast of the Waikato, and it has a particular atmosphere that distinguishes it from the other small towns on this coastline, more creative, more independently minded, somewhat removed from the rhythms of mainstream New Zealand. The left-hand break at Manu Bay is among the longest rideable waves in the world, and the town attracts people who are looking for something that the major centres do not offer. About 4 kilometres south of the town centre, on a private hillside property with views down to the harbour entrance and west to the Tasman Sea, there is a single standing stone. Not a decorative stone placed by a recent landowner, an old stone. Roughly 2 metres tall, rectangular in cross-section, clearly shaped, not rough field stone, but stone that has been worked on at least 2 faces, and set into the ground at a depth that erosion at its base has gradually revealed. The base depth indicates that whoever placed it intended it to remain standing permanently. The property has had multiple owners over the past century, and none of them put it there. The earliest documentary reference to it that local researchers have found is from the 1920s, when a description of the property mentions an old native stone on the hillside above the harbour. There is no record of it being moved or altered since that description. A surveyor who examined the stone at the request of a local historical society in the mid-2000s found that the stone's long axis is oriented to point precisely at the position of the midwinter sunset on the western horizon, as seen from that hillside. Not approximately, precisely. The surveyor's notes, which are held by the Raglan Historical Society, describe the alignment as accurate to within the margin of error of the survey itself. Midwinter solar markers exist within Maori tradition and are documented at other sites in the Waikato region. Whether this stone is one of them, or represents an earlier period of activity in this area, is not a question that has been formally investigated. The property is private. The stone is not publicly accessible. The alignment is real. Number 5, the Taranaki Wall Complex. Mount Taranaki rises from the western coastal plain of the North Island like something placed there deliberately. A near-perfect volcanic cone, standing alone, visible from the sea and from almost every point in the Taranaki region, its summit snow-capped through most of the year. It is one of the most sacred places in New Zealand. For the Maori iwi of Taranaki, the mountain is an ancestor, a presence with genealogy and mana, and a complex relationship with the human communities that have lived in its shadow for many centuries. The wars of the 19th century were fought, in part, over the land around its base. On the eastern and southeastern flanks of the mountain, in the zone where the native bush gives way to farmland, there is a complex of low stone walls that has attracted quiet but persistent attention from researchers for several decades. The walls run in configurations that do not match the boundary patterns of colonial-era farming. They predate, in some cases, the survey lines of the 19th century. They occur in locations where farming operations were never conducted, including some positions quite high on the mountain slopes, above the tree line, where the terrain makes any agricultural purpose impossible. Heritage New Zealand's official position on the wall complex is that the walls represent the remnant of early Pākehā pastoral development in the region. Researchers who have examined the construction technique, the choice of stone, the method of fitting without mortar, the profile of the courses, have argued that some of the walls, particularly those at higher elevations and those that appear to be built to older survey alignments, show characteristics more consistent with pre-European construction methods. The national park boundary takes in part of the wall complex. The walking tracks that access the park do not pass near the wall sections that researchers have found most anomalous. The interpretation panels at the park entrance describe the mountain's geological and ecological significance in considerable detail. They do not mention the walls. A complete survey of the wall system, mapping every section at every elevation, assessing construction technique and relative age, has not been conducted. For a national park in the 21st century, with the resources available to New Zealand's conservation and heritage agencies, that absence is worth noting. Number 4. The Banks Peninsula Tunnel System. Banks Peninsula is the only significant elevated landmass on the Canterbury Plains, an extinct volcanic complex that pushes into the Pacific south of Christchurch, its steep hills covered in what was once dense native bush and is now mostly farmland. Its harbours were among the first places in the South Island to be settled by Maori, and the European settlement of the region began around Akaroa Harbour on the peninsula's southern coast in 1840, making it one of the earliest permanent European communities in New Zealand. In the hills above Akaroa, there are tunnels, not mining tunnels. The basalt geology of Banks Peninsula contains nothing worth extracting, not drainage tunnels, which would serve no function in this terrain. Tunnels cut horizontally into the hillside at various points in the hills above the harbour, running inward for distances that informal measurements have placed between 15 metres and more than 40 metres. The tunnel walls are in some cases lined with fitted stone. The tunnels are dark and partially collapsed and not safe for casual entry. The earliest documentary references to these tunnels come from European settlers in the 1840s and 1850s. Letters and journals from that period, held in the Canterbury Museum archives, describe the tunnels variously as native works of unknown antiquity, ancient passages in the hills, and in one memorable account from 1852, a system of underground ways that the old people here will not speak of. That last reference is to the Maori elders of the period, whose knowledge of the tunnels was evidently both real and private. Ngāi Tahu, the iwi of the South Island, hold knowledge about the tunnels that is not in the public domain. That is as it should be. The knowledge belongs to those who carried it through the generations, and outsiders are not entitled to it simply by asking. What the publicly available record does not explain is the physical fact of the tunnels themselves, the labour involved in cutting them, the purpose they served, and the period in which they were built. Access today is complicated by private land ownership and by the genuinely unsafe condition of the tunnels. Heritage New Zealand has a record of their existence. No formal published assessment of their age, construction technique, or function appears in any publicly accessible document. People have been farming above these tunnels for 170 years. Some of them are still intact, and the questions they raise have not been answered. Number 3. The Marlborough Sounds submerged walls. The Marlborough Sounds at the top of the South Island are a landscape of extraordinary complexity. A coast so broken and folded by the drowning of ancient river valleys that its total shoreline, if you straightened every inlet and bay in reach, would measure more than the entire coastline of New Zealand counted in the conventional way. It is a place of dark green hills dropping to deep blue water, of boats threading narrow channels between headlands, of bachis perched on hillsides accessible only from the sea. Navigation is careful here. The water is not forgiving of inattention. In several of the sounds, Queen Charlotte, Pelorus, Kenepuru, there are submerged stone structures visible at low tide and in calm conditions from the water's surface. Some of these structures are fish weirs, and fish weirs are well understood. Stone fish traps were a sophisticated Maori technology deployed across New Zealand's coastal waters, and examples survive in varying states of preservation from Northland to Southland. They are part of the documented record, but there are submerged wall sections in the Marlborough Sounds that are not fish weirs. The differences are not subtle. These structures are positioned too deep to function as fish traps. They are oriented across rather than along the tidal flow, and they are built to a weight and scale that a fish trap does not require. The stone used in their construction is heavy, fitted work, not the lightweight framing of a fish weir. One section in Pelorus Sound was photographed by a recreational diver in 2016 and brought to the attention of a marine archaeologist at a New Zealand university. An unpublished assessment that the researcher shared informally with colleagues described the structure as a wall of substantial construction, of uncertain function and of uncertain age, requiring formal marine archaeological investigation. That investigation has not happened in any publicly documented form. The Marlborough Sounds are a popular sailing ground, Hundreds of boats move through them every summer. On a calm day with good visibility, the walls are visible from the surface. Most people sail right over them without looking down. But if the submerged walls in the Marlborough Sounds seem strange, wait until we get to number 2. Number 2. The Waitomo Limestone Complex. Waitomo is one of New Zealand's most visited attractions. The glowworm cave draws somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 visitors per year. Boats move through its underground chambers in near silence while the bioluminescent larvae of the fungus gnat Arachnocampa luminosa create a ceiling of blue-white light on the cave roof above the black water. It is one of those experiences that resists adequate description and delivers on its reputation. I do not say that lightly. What the tour operators do not mention, and what the 400,000 visitors per year do not generally know, is that the publicly accessible cave system is a small portion of a much larger complex. The Waitomo cave network extends for many kilometres in every direction beneath the King Country farmland, and large sections of it have never been formally surveyed. The known passages that are not included in the commercial tours are mapped by cavers affiliated with the New Zealand Speleological Society. And beyond the mapped sections, there are passages that remain explored only informally, by cavers who have pushed further into the system than official expeditions have gone. Within those deeper and less documented sections, cavers have reported over the past 30 years a specific category of finding that distinguishes certain areas of the system from natural cave. Evidence of human modification, cut surfaces in the cave walls, passages that appear to have been widened deliberately, the tool marks still visible in the soft limestone, and in at least 2 separate locations reached by separate expeditions at different times, what appear to be constructed chambers, spaces where the natural cave ceiling has been reinforced with fitted stonework, and where the floor has been levelled to a degree that natural cave processes do not produce. Who was underground in the Waitomo system constructing chambers, at what period and for what purpose is not known. The cave network sits beneath land whose ownership involves a complex arrangement between private leaseholders and IWI with interests in the area, and access to the unsurveyed sections requires the agreement of multiple parties. That agreement has not been consistently available to independent researchers. The glowworm boats leave every 15 minutes. The chambers are somewhere in the dark beyond the last electric light, past the point where the tours turn around, and what they were built for has not been formally described. Number 1. The Wairarapa Coastal Fortress. There is a section of the Wairarapa coast, the long, exposed Pacific-facing shoreline south of Castle Point, where the land meets the sea without ceremony, and the weather makes no concessions. That does not look like anywhere else in New Zealand. It is not a landscape that invites the kind of easy appreciation that the country's more photogenic coastlines receive. The wind is serious here. The sea is serious. The cliffs are high and the drop is direct, and there is nothing between you and the ocean all the way to South America. On those cliff tops, and continuing down into the sheltered valleys that cut back from the coast into the hill country, there is a complex of earthworks that does not appear in New Zealand's official archaeological record in any detailed or adequate form. Not the terracing of a volcanic pa. The geology here is not volcanic, and the construction method is different. Not the remnant earthworks of colonial-era farming, which have a different profile and a different logic. Something else. A series of raised platforms and sunken passages, some of them stone-lined, arranged in a configuration that extends over approximately 8 hectares of private farming property. The arrangement suggests defensive function. The sightlines from the main platforms are designed to command the approaches from both the coast and the inland valleys. But the scale is larger than a typical PA, and the construction technique has features that researchers who have examined the site have described as anomalous within the known regional typology of Maori defensive architecture. The property has been in private hands for generations. Researchers have approached the owners at various times over the past 40 years seeking access. Some visits have been permitted, others have been declined. A formal archaeological survey was proposed in 2003 with support from a university department. It did not proceed. A second proposal in 2011 also did not result in published findings. The reasons for the non-progression of these proposals are not clear from the public record. What makes this site the most significant on this list is the specific combination of factors that surround it. A large site, a genuinely anomalous construction method, repeated failed attempts at formal investigation, and something else, a thread of oral history. Local oral tradition in the Wairarapa, recorded by the academic Margaret Orbel in fieldwork conducted during the 1960s and referenced in subsequent published scholarship, includes accounts of a significant fortified settlement on this coast that predated the main tribal genealogies of the region and was associated with an earlier group whose identity and origin are described in the oral accounts only obliquely. Those accounts, which Orbel treated with academic seriousness in her published work, have not been integrated into the mainstream archaeological interpretation of the Wairarapa coast. The earthworks are there. The oral history is there. The formal investigation has not happened, and nobody in any official capacity has provided an account of this site that addresses all of those things together. I have been thinking about this place for years. I have spoken to people who have walked across that land and described the feeling of it, the scale of what is there, the sense that you are walking through something that was built to last and built with purpose. The wind comes off the Pacific and the tussock bends and the ridgelines hold their shapes against the sky, and whatever was built there 800 years ago or 1,000 years ago or longer is still holding its shape too. That is where things sit. The questions do not go away, and I find, the longer I think about it, that I am glad they do not. What all 15 of these places share is a specific kind of gap, the space between what is physically present in the landscape and what the official record is willing to say about it. These are not gaps produced by ignorance. New Zealand has well-funded heritage and conservation agencies. It has university archaeology departments with skilled and dedicated researchers. It has a legal framework for the protection of significant sites that is, on paper, among the stronger such frameworks in the world. The gaps exist alongside all of that, and in some cases the gaps seem to have been maintained by the same institutions that might have been expected to close them. I do not think this is a conspiracy. Institutions protect their interpretive frameworks. That is what institutions do. Individual decisions made by individual people accumulate over years into collective patterns that nobody planned and nobody is entirely responsible for. Private landowners protect their assets and their privacy, which is their right. Communities hold their knowledge, which is also their right. The result of all these individual, legitimate decisions is a historical record that has significant and important omissions. Not because anyone sat in a room and decided to hide things, but because the path of least resistance runs consistently in one direction, and that direction is away from asking difficult questions. What this country looked like before the period that is currently documented, and what was built here and by whom, are questions that the landscape itself is still raising. The walls on the Coromandel ridgelines are raising them. The chambers below the Wairarapa farmland are raising them. The submerged stone in the clear water of the Marlborough Sounds is raising them. The earthworks on the Wairarapa cliff tops are raising them in a voice loud enough that I find it difficult to understand how it has gone unanswered for this long. I've spent a long time listening to this landscape. I do not think it is finished telling us what it knows, and I do not think we have been listening as carefully as we should. I am a grandpa, and grandpas worry. Look after yourself.